In the city of Baghdad, during the reign of Caliph Harun al-Rashid, there lived two men who shared a name but could not have lived more different lives. One was poor, one was rich. One carried burdens on his back, the other carried them in his memory. And on a hot afternoon, when the poor man sat down to rest outside a grand house, the rich man invited him inside and told him a story. Not one story, 7, and each one was about a man who could not stop sailing, even when the sea tried to kill him. Chapter 1: The Rich Man and the Poor Man. The streets of Baghdad were crowded and hot, and the porter named Sinbad had been carrying a heavy load across the city since sunrise. His back ached and his feet were blistered, and the weight of the goods seemed to grow heavier with every step. He stopped to rest in the shade of a grand house, the kind that had marble steps and carved wooden doors and servants coming and going with trays of fresh fruit and sweet drinks. He sat down on the cool stone step and wiped the sweat from his forehead, wondering what it would be like to live in a house like that. Instead of the cramped room he shared with his family, the door opened. A servant in clean white robes looked at him and invited him inside. The porter was confused, but he followed. He was led through a garden of fountains and orange trees and flowering jasmine into a hall where a feast was laid out on silk cloths. At the head of the table sat a man with kind, tired eyes who said, "My name is also Sinbad. I am a sailor. I have been watching you from my window, and I know what it is to carry burdens. You look exhausted. Eat, rest, and then, if you wish, I will tell you how I came to own this house." The porter sat down. He ate dates and lamb and fresh bread and rice with saffron and drank water that tasted like it came from a mountain spring. And as the afternoon sun moved across the courtyard and the shadows lengthened, the rich Sinbad began to speak. His voice was slow and careful, like a man who had learned to weigh every word before letting it leave his mouth. He had not always been rich, he said. He had been young and foolish. He had inherited money from his father and spent it all on wine and women and lazy afternoons doing nothing useful. When the money ran out and the creditors came knocking, he sold everything he had left and bought a ship. He filled it with trade goods and sailed east, looking for a fortune. It was the first of 7 voyages, and it very nearly killed him. Chapter 2: The Whale That Wasn't an Island. On his very first voyage, young Sinbad sailed for days across a calm blue sea. The weather was good and the crew was happy, singing songs and telling stories as the ship cut through the water at a steady pace. They stopped at real islands to trade, buying spices and silks and selling their own goods at a healthy profit. Sinbad began to believe that making money at sea was the easiest thing in the world. He grew confident, even arrogant. The sea had not yet taught him humility, but it would. Then they came to an island. It was small and green and covered in soft grass and low shrubs. It looked like a perfect place to stretch their legs after days aboard the ship. The captain anchored nearby, and the sailors rowed ashore in small boats. Some built a fire to cook a meal. Others lay down on the grass to sleep in the warm sun. Sinbad walked to the far side of the island to explore on his own, and then the island moved. The ground beneath his feet tilted sharply. The grass split open in long cracks. Water poured up from the fissures, cold and dark. Sinbad realized with a horror that turned his blood to ice that this was not an island at all. It was a whale, an enormous ancient whale, the largest creature in all the seas, so old that trees and grass had grown on its broad back over centuries. The sailor's campfire had burned through the whale's thick skin, down to the living flesh beneath, and the whale, feeling the pain for the first time in 100 years, decided to dive. Sinbad ran as fast as his legs could carry him. He reached the edge of the whale and threw himself into the water, just as the great creature sank beneath the waves with a sound like a mountain falling into the sea. Behind him, the sailors, who had not reached the boats, were swallowed by the churning water. The ship, which had been anchored to the whale's back, was pulled under and smashed against the creature's body like a child's toy. Sinbad floated in the open sea for hours, clinging to a piece of broken timber that scraped his arms raw. He watched the sun go down in a blaze of orange and red. He watched the stars come out, cold and distant. He prayed to God and wept for his lost friends. And just before dawn, when he had given up all hope, the current carried him to a real island. He crawled onto the sand on his hands and knees and collapsed face down in the warm sand, grateful to be alive. Chapter 3. The Bird and the Diamonds. Sinbad was rescued from the first island by a passing ship that spotted his signal fire. He returned to Baghdad with a modest fortune and swore to every merchant in the port that he would never sail again. He stayed home for exactly 1 year. Then the restlessness set in. His house felt too small, and the streets felt too crowded. He grew bored and irritable, and his wife told him he was impossible to live with. So he bought another ship, loaded it with goods, and sailed east a second time. He got careless, he found a beautiful island and fell asleep under a tree while the crew explored the shoreline. The ship sailed without him. He woke to find himself completely alone on an empty beach, the ship just a speck on the horizon. He had nothing but the clothes on his back and a single date palm for shade. He sat down and waited to die. But then he noticed something strange about the island. The ground was covered in large white objects that gleamed in the sunlight. Bones, and among the bones, hidden in the shadows, were snakes so enormous that they could swallow a man whole without even trying. Sinbad climbed the tallest tree he could find and looked out across the island, and then he saw the bird. It was called Aroc. It was white and enormous, larger than any bird that had ever lived, with wings that blotted out the sun when it spread them. It landed on the island to eat one of the giant snakes, plucking it from the ground like a man picking a blade of grass. Sinbad had an idea so reckless that it should not have worked. He unwrapped his long turban, crept up to the ROC, and tied himself firmly to the bird's leg. When the ROC flew away at sunset, Sinbad went with it, dangling beneath the great bird like a piece of forgotten cargo. The ROC carried him across the sea to a valley hidden between two mountains. Sinbad untied himself and looked around. He was standing in a valley carpeted with diamonds. The ground glittered like a field of frozen stars. The diamonds were enormous, some the size of his fist, some even larger. But the valley was also infested with snakes, bigger and meaner than the ones on the island, and they could not climb the steep walls, but they ruled the floor. Sinbad was trapped between treasure and death. He filled his pockets and his shirt with diamonds until he could barely move, and then he waited. At sunset, merchants on the cliffs above threw enormous chunks of raw meat into the valley. Eagles swooped down, grabbed the meat, and carried it back up. Sinbad grabbed the largest piece of meat, tied himself to it with his turban, and let an eagle carry him to safety. The merchants were shocked to see a man dangling from their bait. They let him keep the diamonds after he told them his story. Chapter 4. The One-Eyed Giant. After the second voyage, Sinbad was rich again. He gave away many of his diamonds, bought a comfortable house, and swore to his mother that he was finished with the sea forever. He lasted 2 years. Then the restlessness returned, worse than ever. He found himself walking to the harbor just to smell the salt air. He watched ships being loaded with cargo and felt his heart ache with longing. He bought a third ship and sailed east. The third voyage started well, with fair winds and clear skies. But a sudden storm drove his ship far off course and onto the shore of an island that was not on any map. Sinbad and his surviving crew were captured by a tribe of giants. The giants were enormous, the size of date palms, with a single eye in the middle of their foreheads and teeth, like a wild boar's tusks. They herded the terrified sailors into a dark cave and barricaded the entrance with a massive boulder that 10 men could not have moved. One by one, the giants dragged the sailors out of the cave, killed them, roasted them over a fire, and ate them while the others watched. The screams were terrible, and the smell of cooking meat filled the cave. Sinbad watched his crewmates being devoured and knew he would be next. He forced himself to stay calm. He watched the giants carefully and learned their habits. When the giants fell asleep after their feast, full of meat and wine, Sinbad crept across the cave floor. He found a long metal spit that the giants used for roasting. He laid the end in the embers of the fire and waited until it was glowing red-hot. He drove the hot spit into the giant's single eye with all his strength. The giant roared with a sound that shook the walls of the cave. It thrashed blindly, smashing its head against the stone walls, howling in agony. Sinbad and the remaining sailors rolled the boulder away from the entrance and ran for the beach. They launched a small raft just as the giant's brothers came running down from the hills, boulders clutched in their huge hands. They paddled furiously through the dark water, and boulders splashed into the sea behind them, missing the raft by inches. They drifted for days, sunburned and starving, before a passing merchant ship spotted them and hauled them aboard. Sinbad had lost another crew and another ship, but he was alive. Chapter 5. The Island of the Living Dead. The fourth voyage was different from everything Sinbad had experienced before. His ship was caught by a powerful current that pulled it toward a reef. The hole split open like an egg. Most of the crew drowned in minutes, dragged under by the weight of their clothes. Sinbad and a handful of sailors grabbed pieces of wreckage and were washed ashore on an island that seemed, at first glance, like a paradise. There was abundant fruit and fresh water. A village of friendly people came down to the beach to welcome the survivors. They smiled and offered food and shelter. They seemed genuinely happy to help. But Sinbad noticed something strange about them. They were too cheerful. They watched the sailors eat with an intensity that made his skin crawl. And one by one, the sailors who accepted the food began to change. They grew fat and sluggish. Their eyes became vacant. Their minds slowed to a crawl. Sinbad realized the truth with a cold certainty. The food was drugged. The villagers were fattening the sailors like livestock, and when they were too helpless to resist, they were dragged to a burial chamber and laid next to the bodies of the recently dead. It was the custom of this island to bury the dying alive with the dead, so the dead would have company in the afterlife. Sinbad stopped eating the village food. He pretended to be as drugged and mindless as his crewmates. He let himself be dragged to the burial chamber with the others. But inside the dark chamber, he found something he had not expected. The dead had been buried with their treasures. Gold coins, jeweled ornaments, silver cups lay scattered among the bones. In the darkness, his hands found piles of wealth. He filled his pockets with treasure, found a crack in the chamber ceiling that let in moonlight, and climbed out. He walked to the coast, built a small raft from driftwood, and launched himself into the sea. He sailed alone for days, the sun burning his skin and the salt cracking his lips. A merchant ship finally picked him up, half dead from thirst. When he told the captain about the island, the captain made the sign of a cross over his chest and refused to speak of it again. Chapter 6. The Old Man of the Sea. By the 5th voyage, Sinbad was no longer a young man. His thick beard was shot through with grey. His hands were calloused from years of hauling rope. His back ached in cold weather, and his knees complained when he climbed stairs. But the restlessness had not faded with age. It had grown worse, more desperate. He bought a new ship, hired a new crew, and sailed east one more time. The 5th voyage began in disaster. His crew, foolish and curious, found an enormous ROC egg on an island and cracked it open to eat the chick inside. The parent ROC returned while they were still laughing. It dropped boulders onto the ship, smashing the deck to splinters. Sinbad barely escaped, clinging to a piece of broken hull as the ship went down. He washed ashore on another island, alone again. He walked inland, looking for fresh water, and found an old man sitting by a stream. The old man was ancient beyond belief, with white hair that reached his waist and a beard that brushed his knees. He begged Sinbad to carry him across the river. Sinbad, kind by nature and not suspecting danger, lifted the old man onto his shoulders and waded into the water. The old man would not let go. He wrapped his legs around Sinbad's neck and squeezed until Sinbad could barely breathe. He dug his bony heels into Sinbad's ribs. He refused to dismount, no matter how much Sinbad begged or struggled. He rode Sinbad through the forest day and night, forcing him to walk while he slept on his shoulders, feeding him fruit from the trees, driving him like a donkey. Sinbad endured this for weeks. He grew thin and exhausted, his body wasting away. He tried everything to dislodge the old man, but nothing worked. Then he found a wild gourd, filled it with grapes, and let the juice ferment into wine in the tropical heat. He drank some himself and offered the rest to the old man. The old man had never tasted alcohol. He drank greedily until his grip loosened and his head lolled. Sinbad threw him off his shoulders, picked up a large rock, and ended the old man's life with a single blow. He walked to the coast and was rescued by a ship whose captain had heard stories of the Old Man of the Sea. He said Sinbad was the first living man he had ever met who had survived a meeting with it. Chapter 7. The River of Precious Stones. The 6th voyage was supposed to be his last. Sinbad told himself this again and again as he prepared the ship. One more journey to make one more fortune. Then he would retire forever and never look at the sea again. He sailed east with a cargo of fine silks and rare spices, determined to make this the profitable conclusion to his sailing career. But the winds shifted and the currents pulled his ship into waters that no captain recognized. On a moonless night, the ship struck a hidden reef and broke apart with a sound like thunder. Cargo sank, crew scattered. Sinbad washed ashore on an island unlike any he had ever seen. It was not green and tropical. It was barren and rocky, cut through by a fast-flowing river that seemed to glow in the daylight. And the riverbed was paved with gems. Sapphires, rubies, emeralds, and diamonds, all worn smooth by centuries of flowing water, lay scattered across the bottom like ordinary pebbles. Sinbad followed the river upstream, looking for a way out. He found a dark cave where the water emerged from a tunnel that ran straight through the mountain. He had no idea where it led. It could have gone on for miles, or could have opened into another sea. He built a small raft from driftwood, lay down on it, and launched himself into the tunnel. The tunnel was pitch black and narrow. The water was fast and violent. Sinbad was thrown against the stone walls again and again, battered and bleeding from a dozen wounds, barely holding onto his raft as it spun through the absolute darkness. He lost all sense of time. He drifted for what felt like hours, maybe a full day, his eyes straining in the blackness. Then the tunnel opened. He emerged into brilliant daylight, blinking and disoriented on the other side of the mountain. A green valley spread out before him, and in the center of the valley stood a city. The people of the city were astonished to see a man emerge from the mountain river. No one in living memory had ever done it. They took him to their king, who listened to his story with wonder and gave him gifts of gold and silk. Sinbad traded his gems for more gold and sailed home on a ship provided by the king himself. He arrived in Baghdad with more wealth than he had accumulated on all the previous voyages combined. Chapter 8. The Pirates and the Elephant Graveyard. The seventh voyage was not Sinbad's choice. He had promised himself he would never sail again. He was rich enough and old enough and scarred enough. He had nothing left to prove to anyone. But the Caliph of Baghdad summoned him to the palace and asked him to deliver a personal gift to the king of Serendib, a distant island kingdom. Sinbad could not refuse a direct request from the ruler of all believers. He prepared his ship one last time. He sailed east with the Caliph's gift and a small crew of trusted men. The journey was quiet for the first week. Then the pirates came. They swarmed the ship from 3 directions at once, silent and fast. They boarded before Sinbad's crew could even draw their weapons. They killed most of the men and took the survivors, including Sinbad, to be sold as slaves in distant ports. Sinbad was sold to a wealthy merchant who dealt in elephant ivory. His new master saw that Sinbad was educated and clever. He gave him a task. Go into the jungle and hunt elephants for their tusks. Sinbad had no skill with a spear or a bow, but he was desperate to earn his freedom. He followed the elephants day after day, watching them, learning their paths and their habits. He began to respect the great creatures. They were not mindless beasts. They had families and leaders and rituals. One day, hidden in the undergrowth, he watched an old elephant walk away from its herd. It moved slowly and painfully. It was dying. Sinbad followed it and discovered something remarkable. The dying elephant walked to a secret valley hidden deep in the jungle. And in that valley lay the bones of 1,000 elephants, the accumulated ivory of generations. The valley floor was white with tusks. The elephants came here to die among their ancestors, and no human had ever found the place before. Sinbad returned to his master and told him about the graveyard. Expeditions were sent to collect the ivory. The tusks were enormous and perfectly preserved. In gratitude, the master freed Sinbad from slavery and gave him a generous share of the treasure. Sinbad booked passage on the first ship headed west. He sailed home to Baghdad, and this time he truly meant it when he said he would never sail again. Chapter 9. The Promise to Stay Home. Sinbad arrived in Baghdad after 7 long years at sea. He walked through the familiar streets and barely recognized them. The buildings were the same, the markets were the same, the minarets still pointed toward heaven, but he was not the same man who had left. He had sailed away as a young man with black hair and smooth skin. He returned with grey at his temples, a face deeply lined by sun and salt spray, and a fortune so enormous that he could have bought half the merchant's district without haggling. He bought the grand house on the hill, the one with the marble steps and the carved doors and the garden full of fountains and orange trees. He married a kind woman from a good family who knew nothing of the sea and did not ask about the scars on his body. He hired servants to cook and clean and tend the garden. He filled his tables with food and his shelves with books. He swore to everyone who would listen that he would never set foot on a ship again for as long as he lived. His wife believed him because she wanted to. His neighbors believed him because they had no reason not to. The merchants at the port believed him because they had heard him say it before and watched him fail. He almost believed himself. The first year of peace was pleasant. The second year was bearable. By the third year, something had started to go wrong. Sinbad began waking in the middle of the night, sitting bolt upright in bed, his heart pounding. He was listening for something. The wind through the courtyard sounded like waves breaking against a hull. The creak of a shutter sounded like a ship's timbers under full sail. The distant cry of a night bird sounded like a gull over open water. He missed the sea with a physical ache that settled deep in his chest and would not go away. It was not rational. He knew that. He also knew that he had made a promise. And Sinbad the Sailor, for all his flaws, was a man who kept his promises. He stayed on land, but the sea never left him. Chapter 10. The nights he couldn't sleep. The years passed slowly, one after another, like waves on a distant shore. Sinbad grew older, and his hair grew whiter, and his fortune grew larger. He hosted grand dinners and attended parties at the palaces of the wealthy. He advised young merchants on their trade routes and lent money to friends who needed it. He did everything that a wealthy retired gentleman was supposed to do. None of it filled the hollow space inside him. On quiet nights, when the house was dark and the candles had burned down to dripping stubs, and the servants were all asleep in their quarters, Sinbad lay awake with his eyes open and remembered everything. Every single moment of every single voyage came back to him in vivid detail, as if it had happened yesterday. The whale diving beneath his feet, the world tilting and splitting open, the ROC carrying him across an endless sky, the wind screaming past his ears, the giant's eye bursting in the firelight, the hot spit sinking into the flesh, the burial chamber full of gold and bones, the dead men's fingers brushing his ankles in the darkness, the old man's legs locked around his neck, choking the life out of him day by day, the river through the darkness inside the mountain, the walls scraping his skin as he spun through the black water, the elephant graveyard hidden in the green heart of the jungle, the ivory gleaming like white fire. He remembered the fear, the cold water closing over his head, the hunger that hollowed out his stomach, the wounds that festered and healed and left scars. He remembered the men who had died beside him, their names fading even as their faces stayed clear. And he also remembered the way the sun looked across an empty sea at dawn, when he was the only living soul in all that vast blue expanse. He remembered the feeling of surviving something that should have killed him. That feeling was like no other feeling on earth, and in all his years on land, surrounded by comfort and safety and plenty, he had never found it again. He once told his wife, late at night, when honesty came easier, "I am the richest man in Baghdad," and I am also the poorest, because I have everything I could possibly want, and I still want to leave." She did not understand. She pulled the covers up and rolled over. He did not expect her to understand. How could she? She had never seen a whale the size of an island. Chapter 11. The Cost of 7 Voyages. The porter named Sinbad, who had been silent through the entire telling of the 7 voyages, finally spoke. He set down his cup of tea and looked the rich Sinbad directly in the eyes. His question was simple, the kind that cuts to the heart of a matter. Was it worth it? All those voyages, all that danger, the friends you lost to the sea, and the cannibals and the giants, the years of your life that you can never get back. Was it worth the fortune you are sitting on now? Sinbad was quiet for a very long time. The courtyard had grown dark around them. Servants had lit candles and placed them in glass holders around the room. The shadows flickered across his scarred face. He looked down at his hands, gnarled and calloused, the fingernails thickened by years of pulling wet rope and handling salt-crusted rigging. He touched the deep scar on his ribs where a serpent had bitten him on the 3rd voyage. He thought about the faces of the sailors who had died on his ships, men whose names he could no longer always remember, but whose dying screams he could still hear on quiet nights. He spoke slowly, choosing his words with care. The fortune was worth something, he said. It bought this house and this food and this safety. It bought me the freedom to sit here and tell you these stories. But if I could go back and choose again, knowing everything I know now about what the sea demands from a man, I am not certain I would sail at all. The porter waited, not interrupting. Sinbad smiled. It was a sad smile, the smile of a man who had seen too much and still wanted more. But I did sail, and what I saw out there, beyond the horizon that most men never look past, is worth more than all the gold in this house. I saw things that no man in Baghdad has ever seen. I touched the edge of the known world. I survived storms that should have drowned me, and creatures that should have eaten me, and lands that should have kept me forever. I lived, and that is worth something too. Chapter 12. The sea he could not leave. When the sun had fully set and the candles were burning low in their holders, the rich Sinbad finished his story. The 7 voyages were done. The words had all been spoken. He stood up slowly, his joints aching from sitting so long, and walked to a wooden chest against the wall. He opened it and took out a small leather pouch, heavy with gold coins. He walked back to the porter and placed the pouch in his hands. "Take this," he said. "It is not charity. You earned it. A story needs a listener, the way a ship needs a harbor. Stories are heavy to carry alone, and you have lightened my burden more than you know." The porter thanked him with a voice thick with emotion. He left the grand house and walked through the moonlit streets of Baghdad, the pouch of gold warm and heavy in his hand. He thought about the whale that was not an island, the ROC that carried a man across the sky, the giant with one eye, the old man who would not let go, the river of gems, the elephant graveyard. He walked through the silent city thinking about all of it, and he realized that his own hard life was not so bad after all. He went home to his wife and his small house. He paid his debts and bought new shoes for his children. And he never complained about carrying heavy loads again, because he knew there were heavier burdens a man could carry. Sinbad the Sailor sat alone in his hall, listening to the night, the fountains in the garden, the wind in the orange trees, the distant barking of a dog somewhere in the city. He could not hear the sea from here, Baghdad was too far inland, and the sea was days away across the desert. But he knew it was out there, vast and dark and patient, the same sea that had tried to kill him 7 times and failed. He would never sail again. He knew that now, but he did not need to. He had already sailed far enough for 10 lifetimes. And in his dreams, every single night, he still felt the deck beneath his feet and the salt wind in his face. And that, he had decided long ago, was enough. The end.